All right.
Hey. Testing. Okay.
Trying to think what else. Oh. Okay. Oh, it's on. Yay. Well, welcome everybody this afternoon. I'm David Dundee. I'm Director of Education, and actually I'm also an astronomer, and so this subject today is near and dear to my heart. And every year about this time, we've been asked about buying telescopes. And before I get on to our main subject today, I wanted to tell you about some exciting things that are coming up here at the museum. First of all, thank you to our sponsor, Century Bank of Cartersville, for supporting the museum and Lunch and Learn. This Friday, December 1st, we'll have in the evening the opening of our amber exhibit. It's really cool because all sorts of prehistoric insects have been trapped in the amber, and we'll have some great images of microscopic images of various insects that have been caught in the amber. So it's very cool. Plus, I was going to tell you the observatory is going to be open that night. It is scheduled to be open that night. It's also scheduled to be rain that night. So I don't think we're going to see anything through the observatory. But there are free planetarium shows that night, so you might want to come for that and amber. Also, moving along in the schedule on December 10th and December 9th, we have our annual PJ party, and more importantly for me, I'm a train person also, we have our annual Festival of Trains, and so this year we're filling the Great Hall with trains, and also this banquet area is going to be filled with trains. And if you like model trains or you have small ones around in your household or in your family that are into trains, or old ones like me who are into trains, bring them because it'll be a fun weekend of model trains. We'll have N-gauge trains, Lego trains, and big trains, G-gauge, garden gauge trains that weekend, and a scavenger hunt with a prize. So you can, I will tell you folks ahead of time, the prize is a train whistle to annoy parents all the way home from the museum. Then on December the 20th is our next Lunch and Learn, and that will be all about snow. We'll have a most excellent presentation by our fantastic science staff on the science of snow. So if you want to come and see some snow, because in Cartersville it may be the only snow you're going to see during the winter, you might want to come by for that presentation. That will be on December the 20th. All right. So this time of the year, I often get asked about buying a telescope. I want to buy a telescope for Christmas. I want to buy a present for my husband or wife. I want to buy a present for my child or grandchild. What do I buy? And so the three questions I always ask people when they begin their quest for a telescope is, of course, how much do you want to spend? And who is it being bought for? If you're buying it for a child, it's very different than buying it for an adult, and it's very different buying it for an older adult, and I'll tell you why as well. So who you're buying it for, and then what do you want to do with your telescope? Are you going to use it for camping? Are you just going to throw it in the back seat of your car and go camping? Or are you going to have it permanently in some structure or permanently in your backyard? Exactly, what are you going to do with your telescope? Is it going to be used for photography? Is it going to be just for casual viewing of the moon and Saturn's rings once in a while? What are you going to use your telescope for? And often when people ask me about their first astronomical instrument, I steer them towards a pair of binoculars. Now, people get kind of deflated when I say binoculars because they say, oh, I want to buy a telescope. But binoculars are a very cool way to begin your journey in learning about the nighttime sky. And you can buy a reasonably good pair of binoculars for less than $200 to begin your investigation of the sky. And binoculars, when you buy them, you will notice on the outside of the box there are two numbers. It'll have a number, an X, and another number. And so typically binoculars like this one are 7x50, 7 by 50s, and is what they're called. The first number is magnification, how much it magnifies. Magnification for binoculars is not terribly important, but typically 7, 8, or 10 magnification is good enough for what you need. The second number is important, and that is the number of millimeters this lens, called the objective lens, is pointing at the sky. And the reason that's important is the bigger the lens, the more light it lets in, and the brighter your image. Now, this is different from bird watching or taking the binoculars to the Falcons game, because now you're dealing with stuff that's low light and things like stars. So you're trying to bring in as much light as possible. So the bigger that number is, the better. The only problem is, the bigger that number is, the heavier the binoculars. So don't go beyond 50 millimeters unless you're Charles Atlas and can lift, large weights without any problem. But unless you have Arnold Schwarzenegger with you, stay with 50 as your maximum. And usually when I recommend binoculars, I say 10 by 50 is a really good way to use binoculars. And you can see with these binoculars, just with these binoculars, things like you can make out the moons of Jupiter, you can see the rings of Saturn, just barely, but you can see star clusters, and you can see groupings of stars and start to learn the stars using your binoculars. They're very portable. They're also binoculars are easily droppable. Well, not from great heights, but if you have children around, they knock them over. It's not a great big deal. And also, if you're starting a new hobby, this is not a huge investment, and you can use them for other things. You can use them for bird watching or taking the Falcons game or whatever. So binoculars are typically a good way to start. Well, if you're determined to buy a telescope, well, then you're looking at different things. So there are two kinds of telescopes I'm going to be talking about today. I want to show them to you physically, and I'm going to talk about them in more detail. There is what's called a refractor, and refractors have lenses at each end. You have reflectors, and reflectors typically have mirrors in them. Some have what's called a Newtonian reflector, will have a mirror at the back of the telescope, or you can get a telescope that has a mirror in it, and they look like this. This is called a catadioptric, or a multiple optical telescope, and you have a range of sizes of telescopes. And the nice thing about telescopes, again, don't worry about magnification with telescopes. You worry about the light gathering capacity. Often when you buy telescopes, the biggest letters on the ads on the boxes is, it brings in 10,000 magnification or 1,000 magnification. Word to the wise. For every inch of diameter of telescope, you can effectively magnify something by a factor of 50. So if you have a 4-inch telescope and you put in a high-power eyepiece that magnifies 800 times, you will see nothing. Because when you put an eyepiece in a telescope to make the magnification greater, you're spreading out the light. Well, if you're only bringing in a little bit of light and you spread out that light a lot, your image is going to be really faint. You're not going to see anything. And often I get people coming in January, my telescope doesn't work. It's broken. And they'll bring their telescope, and I'm more than happy to talk to people who bought a telescope and help them. And they've got their highest power eyepiece in there. They've got another special eyepiece called a Barlow lens that doubles the magnification, and we're like at 1200 power. And I take all that stuff off, and I put their lowest power magnification eyepiece in there and say, now look through it. You fixed it. Yeah. And so remember, when you're dealing with magnification with telescopes, that's not terribly important. The important thing is how much light it brings in. So the bigger the diameter, the more light it brings in. This is a 3-inch telescope. This is a 4-inch telescope. And this is an 8-inch telescope. So if you double the amount of diameter of your telescope, the amount of light gathering capacity actually goes up by a factor of 4, because it's the square of the radius as you make the mirrors bigger and bigger. But your cost also goes up, and the weight of the telescope goes up as you get to bigger and bigger telescopes. A telescope like this, depending on sale around Christmas, you can probably go find them in department stores and stuff, $150, $200. This nice 8-inch telescope. Wow, it looks great, and it's got all this cool bells and whistles on it. $6,000. So it's a different investment. It also requires a little more setup. You can see the tripod is hefty, and you want to have a hefty tripod on your telescope because the first gust of wind, believe me, outside, it gets windy from time to time. You don't want your telescope to blow over. So never buy more telescope than you can handle. If you've got a 5- and 6-year-old, 7-year-old active at home and you're buying a telescope, I'd recommend starting with a refractor. Refractors will forgive you if you knock them over. They're easy to use, and they're easy to throw in the back seat of your car or take camping with you, whatever. When you get to reflectors, reflectors don't like to be knocked over, and things can happen inside the reflector, and you're not going to necessarily break the mirror, but you can misalign the optics and stuff. So these require more care. So be careful when you're looking for telescopes. Where do I buy a telescope? Typically, around this time of the year, you can find in the large department stores and larger stores refractors all over the place. They'll have different brand names. The brand names aren't terribly important because almost all the lenses are made in the same factory in Japan. They have a volcanic ash in Japan that makes good optics. In fact, the same optics that we have in our planetarium projector came from Japan. But anyway, refractors you can find lots of places. Reflectors, you're going to have to order online. There are no telescope stores in the state of Georgia. And so if you're looking for higher quality telescopes or higher cost telescopes, you're going to have to order online. And the best thing to do if you're uncertain and you're looking at telescopes and, boy, I'm confused, what's going on, send us an email. I'll be glad. We answer questions like that all the time. And myself and our astronomer, Carissa, who I thought was here, she was right here, a minute ago, maybe she escaped, we'll be glad to answer questions like that all the time. So let's get into some of the more details about this. And so I'm going to move ahead in my slides here, and hopefully, I'm going to hopefully move ahead in this thing. Let's see. There we go. So this is a telescope you probably will not be buying. That's our 20-inch telescope out in our observatory. But it is a reflecting telescope, and it has a mirror that's 20 inches across. And so the advantage of that telescope is the light gathering capacity. Now, the magnification that when you come through the observatory and look through will probably be very similar to the magnification in this telescope or this one. It's not magnification that really separates these telescopes. It's the light gathering capacity. So a 20-inch telescope now has a much larger surface area to gather up light, and that's the name of the game in astronomy, is gathering up as much light, because you're looking at faint things, and you want to make those things look bright. And so that's what our telescope looks like in the observatory. And the basics of how a refractor works is that the light comes in the front of the telescope and comes back to the back. And at the back of the telescope is your eyepiece. And that's the part you put in the back of the telescope, and that eyepiece is how you govern what the magnification will be of the whole system. So typically, when you buy a telescope, it will come with 3 eyepieces, sometimes only 2, but usually 3. It'll be a low-power eyepiece, medium power, and a high-power eyepiece. 99% of the time, you're going to use the low-power eyepiece because you're looking at faint things. Occasionally, if you're looking at the moon or you're looking at Jupiter or maybe Venus, you can pop in a higher power eyepiece. The problem with higher power eyepieces is not only is your image fainter, it also magnifies all of the things that are going on in the air above you. You've got about 200 miles of air between you and outer space, and so all of that atmosphere is moving around. And so if it's a kind of a windy or a turbulent night and you put in a high-power eyepiece, you also magnify all of the moving of the images, so the images become more unsteady. So most of the time we use the lowest power eyepiece. Same in the observatory in the 20-inch telescope. We use usually the lowest power eyepiece to look at things like deep sky objects. It's only like with bright things like Jupiter or the moon that will put a higher power eyepiece. Sure. Yes, so that is the focal length of the eyepiece, and in eyepieces, the higher the number, the lower the magnification. So the 25 is going to be the one you're going to be using. All telescopes, by the way, flip the image upside down. Often, manufacturers will sell you what's called an erecting eyepiece, another piece of glass to put in there to make everything right side up. Unless you're bird watching, throw it away. You don't need it. And the reason is, it doesn't really make a difference which way things are in space. And the other thing to remember is every time you pass light through a surface of glass, you lose 10% of the brightness. So yeah, you can slap in the erecting eyepiece in there to make things right side up, but you've lost 10% of the light, and now Jupiter's right side up. Well, who cares? So don't use the erecting eyepiece. That's my advice on that. Refractors are very easy to use. There's no moving parts inside except for focusing the eyepiece back and forth, and you want a sturdy mount for the refracting telescope to sit on. There are very cheap refractors sold out there, and you'll see them in the department stores. They'll be like for $65. Oh, it's an astronomical telescope. You can see the wonders of the universe. And they'll have a tabletop tripod with it. Boy, those are useless because you're out there in the wilderness and you're looking for a tabletop. Really? No. So don't bother with those. Reflectors. This is a Newtonian reflector. And the way this works, the light comes down, reflects off a mirror, and how much light it gathers depends on the diameter of the mirror. The bigger the mirror, the brighter the image, the more expensive the telescope, the heavier the telescope. So if you're buying this telescope for yourself, consider the weight. And so if you're an old person like myself, I start to consider how heavy a telescope I want to haul outside to look at things. And so weight is a consideration when you're buying telescopes. They have to be fairly hefty because you don't want them to blow over. You want them to be a stable platform to look at things. But anyway, the light comes down, reflects off the mirror, comes back up to a smaller mirror inside of here called the secondary mirror, and that reflects the light out the side of the telescope. This one, just like the refractor, has an eyepiece in it, and the way you change the magnification is by changing the eyepiece in the telescope. And so this instrument was actually a design by Isaac Newton. That's why it's called a Newtonian telescope. And it's a very basic kind of reflector. But this does not react well to being knocked over. The mirror has to be lined up specially to make sure the light comes in the right direction. So this one is a little less child-friendly. But if you have an older child that can take care of things, this is not a bad way to start. The next kind of telescope is a reflector, and I believe I have a picture of that, so let me move on. There we go. And this is called a catadioptric telescope. Pry off the top. And it works the same as the other reflector with one little difference. The mirror itself is back here, just like the Newtonian telescope, but in catadioptric telescopes, if you were to take it apart, the mirror would look like a giant donut because there's a hole in the middle of the mirror. And the reason there's a hole is because the light comes down here, reflects off this back of this telescope, just like in this diagram, comes back to the secondary mirror, which is right up in here, but the secondary mirror is pointed straight back through the back. And so to use this telescope, you get the convenience of looking at the back. And that's the convenience of this telescope. This is the same optical arrangement as our 20-inch telescope we have out in the observatory. And the front here is not just a dust cap, by the way. There's a piece of glass here, but that's actually what's called a corrector plate. It corrects for what's called spherical aberration, makes the image more crisp. So it's not just a dust cover. Anyway, and the way you again change the magnification of this telescope, here's the eyepiece, just like the other two telescopes, and you put in the eyepiece here. This one has an extra piece of glass that makes it convenient for you. It has a little prism here, so you're not looking at a peculiar angle. You're looking straight down, which makes it a little easier to look at it. Most telescopes will come with this little elbow, and it looks like this. And all it does is takes the light and puts it at a right angle. You lose a little bit of light that way, but it makes it much more easy on your back looking through the telescope. So I do recommend using that. And the convenience of having the hole in the mirror so the light comes out the back bumps up the price of the telescope by about a factor of 100%. So the Newtonian telescope is cheaper for inch for your telescope, but in order to observe through it, you've got to be here. Now, with a little 4-inch telescope, that's easy. When you get to the bigger 6 and 8-inch diameter telescopes, the tubes are a bit longer, and they become a little bit, a little bit more challenging to use. So this is convenient in a smaller version. That one's convenient, but you're going to pay the price for it. All of these telescopes, except this one, these two telescopes, and these also will have it, but this particular one doesn't, will have a motor in it. It's called a clock drive. And that's important because we live on a planet that's moving all the time. It's very annoying because stuff in the sky keeps moving. So if you point your telescope at something, it's going to be out of your field of view within about 20 seconds because the Earth keeps turning. And so the clock drives in these telescopes are important because it keeps the telescope tracking on the object in the sky. All of these telescopes have a motor that moves at one rate. That's the celestial rate. That's just the rate the Earth is turning. And you can use it anywhere on the planet, except if you go south of the equator, then you need a different motor because you have to make the telescope go the other way. And I won't get into that today, but you're pointing not at the North Star, but at the South Pole, so things are different. Just a little warning in case you want to take your telescope to Australia. All right, so let's move on. The telescopes, basically, when you're using an eyepiece, you got to remember as you change magnification, there is a benefit, but you do lose some of the light. The other thing about a telescope, the two things that move on a telescope are the altitude, up and down, basically, from horizon to the zenith, and the azimuth is along the horizon. So those are the two ways that a telescope typically can move looking at the sky. Telescopes, typically when you buy a small refractor, will have little knobs on them. If you get a telescope without a motor, which is possible if you don't want to bother having a clock drive motor on your small refractor, it's not the end of the world. If you're not doing photography with it, you're just using it for casual observation. But you will need the little knobs because that will keep you'll be able to use those knobs, twist them slowly to follow objects in the sky. And remember, whatever you're looking at, 20 seconds later, it's out of the field of view. I know that seems like it's really quick, but it really is. When you look at it through a telescope, you turn off the drive on the 20-inch out there, you can see how fast things zip along without a drive. So there are various kinds of mounts that you can buy for telescopes. Typically, you will find most of the mounts are equatorial mounts like this, or altazimuth mounts. This is an equatorial, what's called a fork mount. So the different kind of mounts the telescopes come on. It's just ways of being able to use the telescope to effectively look at things throughout the entire sky. So the telescope, once it's set up, it has to be, you have to be able to see the entire sky, and it can do that with the telescope mount. Most telescopes, when you align them, they'll be aligned on the North Star. And here at Cartersville, you will find that if you use a compass, it will be very close to true north. And here it's about the North Star is about 34 degrees above the horizon. And usually, most telescopes will start your alignment using the North Star. Some will have some electronics to associate with computers. I'm not going to get into that today because Carissa is going to cover all that in January, how to use your telescope. There's a kind of mount called a Dobsonian mount. It's very inexpensive, and the telescope can move up and down and left and right. There's no clock drive. You move it yourself. The only drawback with this telescope is you really have to know a little bit about the sky. The nice thing about some of the newer models of go-to telescopes that have kind of a memory inside of where things are in the sky is that you can use your computer to ask your telescope to go directly to objects in the sky. This one, you have to have kind of an idea of where stuff is to find it. You will notice that this telescope here has an extra telescope on it, and so does this one. And these are called finder telescopes. And finder telescopes are like little refractors. They have a wide field of view, and so when you're aiming your telescope, these help you find things in the sky. So if you're looking for something and you know where it is and you want to aim your telescope, the easiest thing to do is use these finder telescopes. Because remember, another thing about these big telescopes is their field of view is very small. So if you think of the moon is a quarter of a degree in the sky is a half a degree in the sky. That's the diameter of a full moon, half a degree. Well, you cannot fit a full moon in this telescope. You can fit maybe a 16th of a moon in here, and maybe, I don't know, a quarter of a moon in these. So you're looking at a very small piece of the sky at a time. So the finder telescope really helps you. You can see a broad piece of the sky at a time and be able to aim your telescope. So finder telescopes are kind of nice to have on your telescope, and they all come with that. Buying binoculars. Binoculars are very simple optical arrangements. They're not the most efficient in transferring light because they have prisms inside, so you lose about 20% of the light inside binoculars, but they're a good way to start your hobby. They're a lower investment, and they're very portable, and if you're going places and you just want to have binoculars with you, if you're going out, out hiking or something, rather than hauling a telescope, binoculars are nice to have. And you can buy them almost in any large department store. Of course, Amazon has everything, but you can mail order them. But again, I would recommend, if you're buying binoculars for astronomy, 10 by 50. So a power of 10, and a diameter of your objective lens pointing towards the sky is about 50 millimeters. And again, in a refractor, here's the objective lens. And in most boxes, in most advertisements, they will give you the diameter of the lens in millimeters or centimeters, so you have to do your own conversion back into inches, but that's the way you'll find them in most packaging. And again, that's the objective lens, and that's the part that gathers up the light. When you're photographing through a telescope, you're not going to see stuff like that. Unless, well, anyway. This is, of course, from the Webb telescope, and this is imagery with a far bigger telescope, and of course it's been processed with various colors to bring together this image. So what am I going to see through my telescope? Well, it's not going to be anything like that either. So it's going to be more like that. This is an image through a refractor, and this is an image of a nebula. It's called a planetary nebula, and there are lots of them out there in the sky, and there's about a half dozen that are bright enough to easily be seen with a small telescope like this. It'll look like a little fuzzy ball. And so you have a whole class of objects in the sky that I classify as fuzzy things. So galaxies, nebulae, planetary nebulae like these, they're all going to look a little fuzzy. But remember, they're, 1,500, 2,000 light years away, and you're looking at fairly faint light, and you would look pretty fuzzy, too, at that distance. So, and with galaxies, by the way, there is a bright galaxy you can see in the autumn, and it's called the Andromeda Galaxy. It's one of the closer galaxies to ours. It's probably one of the brightest galaxies if you're in the northern hemisphere to see. And you can see it with the naked eye. You can see it with a pair of binoculars, or if you have a small telescope, you'll see something like that. And so that's an object that's 2.1 million light years away. And you can certainly see the Andromeda Galaxy with any of these small telescopes. Another good thing that you can see with telescopes are clusters, and there are lots of clusters of stars to be seen in the sky. And so with a small telescope, don't be, put off by the fact, oh gosh, I can't see stuff like the Webb telescope. There's plenty of wonders that you can see with a small telescope and really enjoy. And so certainly take a look with that, because it's really pretty cool. This is another cluster. It's called a globular cluster. Some famous ones are in the summer sky, and they're just masses of about 100,000 stars all in one place. And the bigger your telescope, the more stars you can resolve in the cluster. But even with a small telescope like this or this, you're going to see something like that. So that's pretty cool. The planet Saturn. Well, if you want to see the rings of Saturn, you can make them out with binoculars. A view through this or this telescope will give you rings of Saturn. You can easily see at least one of the moons of Saturn. Saturn has over 100 moons, by the way. But there's a large moon called Titan that you can easily find with a small telescope. And so the rings of Saturn are really pretty. And there's a planet a mere 1 billion miles away, and you can see it thanks to your telescope. Now, with the naked eye, Saturn would look like a yellow dot. But with a telescope, you can make out all of that detail. With a bigger telescope, like an 8-inch telescope, you can make out more detail. Again, because you've got a bigger mirror that's bringing in more light, you start to see more stuff. And so you can do that. But you pay for it in the cost and how heavy the telescope is and so on. So it kind of depends on what you want to do. The moons of Jupiter, even with a pair of 10 by 50 binoculars, you can make out the moons. With a small telescope that's like this refractor, you can make out the moons of Jupiter. Jupiter, again, has almost 100 moons, but 4 of them are very bright, and you can watch them change position from night to night. As you get to the bigger reflecting telescopes, you can also make out more and more detail on the cloud tops of Jupiter. So you can make out the stripes of Jupiter easily with a small telescope. With a slightly bigger telescope, like this 8-inch telescope, you can make out things like the great red spot on Jupiter. And you can see actual changes in the planet from night to night. In fact, the moons of Jupiter go around the planet in hours. And so even when you're observing over a whole night, you can see differences of the way the moons are arranged around Jupiter in one single night, which is pretty cool. You can also notice as you look around the sky, you will find there are stars called double stars. Over 50% of the stars in the sky are double, triple, or more complex. And usually they just look like 2 dots. You say, ho-hum, 2 dots. But some of them are really pretty. And this is an example of a pair of stars in the constellation of Cygnus. And they have colors. And you can make out the colors, again, probably with the 8-inch telescope, maybe a little bit with a 4-inch telescope. Refractor, it'd be a little tougher. Because, again, you have to bring in enough light for your eyes to see those colors. But the colors are possible to see. There's one other kind of observing that I'll talk about, and that's solar observing. And I got to, again, warn you about solar observing. Anytime you observe the sun, it's potentially dangerous. So here are some safety tips. Number 1, sometimes refractors are sold with what's called a solar filter that screws into the eyepiece, and you put it right there. Do not use them. If it comes with one, just throw it in the trash. And the reason is the way telescopes work is they gather up light. They make faint stuff bright, right? So all the sunlight's being gathered up. It's being focused on this little glass filter right here, all the light and the heat, and those filters will crack when they get hot. And when they do, you will burn your eye. So don't do that. The only safe way to observe the sun with all of these telescopes is to have a filter that goes on the front. That means that the heat and the light of the sun is attenuated by about 99% before it even gets in the telescope. This eyepiece stays nice and cool, and you can observe the sun safely. There are safe filters that you can buy. Don't make them yourself. And you can find safe filters that will fit on your telescope, and you can see things like sunspots. The sun right now is terribly active. It's got all sorts of sunspots on it right now. Sunspots are cooler places on the sun, and you can watch them change from day to day. Not only will the shapes of the sunspots change, but the sun makes one complete turn every 26 days at the equator. It depends on where you are, because the sun's not solid, so the middle turns faster than the upper poles. But anyway, you can watch their position change from day to day. It's really cool. and you can make pictures or sketches of the sunspots as they change. Years and years ago, a church group came to me and said, "Oh, we're observing the sun." I said, "Oh, that's great, that's great." And I said, "We can observe its turning." And I said, "Oh, yeah, that's true." So yeah, we just stare at the sun. I said, "What?" I said, and so our whole church group goes out and stares at the sun. We can see it turning. And I said, "Well, yeah, I guess you're observing your eyes beginning to disintegrate is what you're observing." But anyway, so don't do that. Don't stare at the sun. And one other thing, we've got an eclipse coming up. It's April the 8th, and here in Cartersville, we're going to see 60, what percent? 84%. There we go. 84%, which is pretty good. You won't notice a lot of difference in lighting here as the eclipse goes underway, because even 16% of the sun's pretty bright. But you will be able, if you have a solar filter, to observe the eclipse as the moon covers the sun. And if you happen to be traveling out west, like millions will be for this eclipse, you'll be able to see the sun completely covered by the moon. This eclipse will start in Mexico, come through Texas, through the midsection of the country, Illinois, and up into the northeast. And if you're planning to go that way, kind of look at where the weather will be the best, because you want to go where the least cloud cover will take place. But I will warn you, if you haven't made hotel plans by now, they're pretty much, you can rent stuff, but it's really, really expensive. But the good news is that the NASA channel will broadcast the eclipse live, streaming it, and we'll have it here for observers, and also we'll have our observatory open to see the 84% eclipse going on here in Cartersville, so you can use it. So a quick summary as I wind things up here, as I'm looking at my time. You've got two basic kinds of telescopes. You've got the refractors, you've got reflectors, and the things to look for when you're buying a telescope is how much do you want to spend, what are you going to use your telescope for, and also how portable does it have to be, and who's going to be using the telescope, who's your audience. Is it going to be small children? Is it going to be you? And kind of evaluate what you want to do with a telescope. Astronomy is a wonderful hobby. It's a lifelong hobby. And once you get infected with it and enjoy the sky, it's great. So as somebody who's devoted their life to teaching astronomy, I can tell you it's a great lifelong thing. And I'm going to stop right here and let Hannah field questions.
David, thank you so much. Everybody, let's give David a hand.
Oh.
So like David said, we are moving into our question and answer portion of our Lunch and Learn today. And as for that, it was available on our YouTube channel after the fact. So I'm going to come to you with the microphone if you'd like to ask a question so that we can save it for posterity.
Do the telescopes come with the tripods, or how do you buy the right tripod for the telescope?
Yes, good question. They all come with tripods. And the only ones you got to be cautious about is sometimes, if you're, hunting around at Christmas and you're at CVS or Walmart or something, and they have like the tabletop $69 telescope, beware, because, they may be tabletop tripods or something. So, kind of be careful if you're buying really inexpensive telescopes. I would say if you're buying a refractor starting out, if it costs a whole lot less than $200, if it's like, much, much cheaper than that, beware, because you're maybe buying a toy, not a good telescope.
So David,
they all come with tripods, yeah.
Okay, they all come with tripods.
Yep,
Excellent.
got
Thank
it.
you.
Yep.
A related question. What would not come with a telescope that we would need to buy?
Telescopes come with pretty much everything you need. The only thing they might not have is a good solar filter. I'd look for that. And of course, any attachments for photography, they're not going to come with that most likely. But other than that, they'll pretty much come self-contained. Some telescopes, be careful. There are a few out there that will only operate if they're connected to a laptop. So just kind of be careful on the fine print. Sometimes the electronics might require it, but for the most part, it's complete.
All right, our next question.
What planets would be best for viewing for different types of telescopes?
Oh, okay. So you got 5 choices of planets to see easily with a telescope. Jupiter and Saturn are usually the crowd pleasers, the easiest ones you can see with small telescopes. Venus is easy to see with binoculars or a small telescope. Mars is a challenge sometimes. It depends where Mars is in its orbit. If it's close to the Earth, Mars looks pretty good. If it's far away, Mars will just look like a little red blob. And it doesn't matter if it's this telescope or that one, it just looks like a little red. Even the 20-inch, it'll look like a little red blob when it's far away. And then the planet Mercury is a tough one because it's always close to the sun, either very near sunrise or very near just after sunset, and it's low on the horizon. You can catch it. It's a tough one to see. And then Uranus and Neptune are reachable with telescopes, but they're going to have to be the larger ones because they're kind of faint.
All right. Our next question.
Is there some type of publication that lets us know where
Mhm.
these are?
Oh, absolutely. If you get online, there are not only are there things that publish where the planets are, there are apps you can put on your phone or on your computer that will tell you where to do it. My wife always waves around the app she has on her phone for, what planet is that or what star is that, and she keeps complaining, why don't you have that on your phone? I said, well, I don't need it. I know what that is. But anyway.
All right.
Do you have a website that you would recommend where to look for telescopes that are of quality?
There's not one particular website. If you look, the Astronomical Society of the Pacific, I believe, has a sub-web page talking about buying telescopes. But the big manufacturers, Celestron and Meade, are the 2 biggest manufacturers of telescopes. There are a few others, but as I said at the very beginning, as you start doing your research and you're coming up with questions, just send me an email or send Carissa an email, and we'll be glad to answer your questions about whatever you have for steering you in the right direction, best we can.
I'm sorry, one more question. It's about what if you wanted to use your phone? Is there any hints that you can take a picture?
Yes.
No, you can take a picture.
Yeah, take pictures. So actually, you can buy an attachment to the telescope to put your iPhone in the back of the telescope to take pictures, because the toughest part is lining up the camera with the telescope to take pictures. And there are attachments. I will say that probably it'll work on any of these telescopes, but usually the bigger ones are a little more stable to add more weight of your phone on there. But yeah, you absolutely can. There are iPhone adapters, and that's the way to go if you're going to take pictures of stuff. Yeah, with your phone anyway.
All right, this is going to be our last question.
Ooh.
I realize this is probably out of scope for your lecture, but just a quick question.
Was that a pun?
On astrophotography, because you did mention it earlier.
Uh-huh.
Mounts for astrophotography and refractors versus reflectors for that, especially for deep space objects.
Yeah,
like
so
nebula and that sort of thing.
typically for photography, reflectors are better for deep space photography than refractors. Refractors perform the best on solar system objects, the moon, Jupiter, and Saturn. But for deep space stuff, usually the reflecting telescopes are the way to go for good stable platforms. And the nice thing is that technology has changed so much in the past 20 years that cameras that used to be big and lunky have gone down to small things that you can just plug into your eyepiece, and they connect directly to your laptop, and so you can use all your some of the apps you have on your laptop to enhance images and stuff. So it's become so easy to do pictures with your telescope. Yeah.
Well, David, once again, thank you so much.
Thank you.